Red Cave Podcast. Reading tonight from There Are Giants in Those Mountains, Parts 1 through 3. And then I heard them lift a box and creak across my soul with those same boots of lead again. Then space began to toll, as all the heavens were a bell and being but an ear, and I in silence some strange race wrecked, solitary, here. Emily Dickinson. There were giants in those mountains. There were giants in those mountains. At least that's what Trevor first told me when he proposed that we pitch in on some raw, unimproved land in Alaska. He showed me a satellite image on his computer of the 7 acres he was eyeing, and just 2 miles north of the lake adjacent to the 7 acres. He asked me to stare at the blown-up image of the snowy mountain ranges and tell me the first thing I saw. We were sitting in my living room at the time, a sad 1-bedroom on the first floor of an apartment complex, too low on the listing for a pool, but just marginalized enough for a workout room with cable TV. The price on the lot was reasonable, but only because, I reminded him, it was virtually unreachable. No one ventured that far north in Alaska, save for the few survival shows we watched on TV, and they were promised hundreds of thousands of dollars for their efforts. He assured me that the land was reachable, but with the right know-how. He tried to convince me that there were vast networks that were forgotten, but that were apparent on any map, which had been constructed by highly advanced civilizations in the past. They were heavily obscured by tree cover at this point, but the entrances to these access routes were still marked by the bodies of the dead men and women that built them all those eons ago. I pictured in my mind sparkling gates of bone or something along those lines, but he told me to set aside those fantastical images cast from the silver screen and unfocus my eyes as I stared at the satellite image on his beat-up laptop screen. I did just that, but I couldn't make sense of the significance of this particular mountain range presented for my scrutinization. I began to zoom in until there were only pixels, and he slapped my hand away so that he could return it to its former layout. Then I saw it. But the first feature to give it all away was the sloping hair, resembling a network of glacial rivers cascading down the frozen foothills. There was the swan-like curve of the neck, the featureless face and profile, mounded waist, and acute legs tucked in fetal style. A female giant had laid down here in her final resting place, and I couldn't deny Trevor's conviction. And the look on my face must have given me away, because he was grinning as he stroked his neck-long beard, beady eyes glimmering in the blue light of the LCD screen. He didn't let on any more than the fact that this burial ground was expertly positioned in such a way to act as a marker. Her grave wasn't far from a notoriously treacherous river inlet that dumped out into a 4-corner arrangement of lakes, one of which linked directly with the lake catty-corner with our land. Most locals would dissuade the less experienced tourist or outdoorsman from braving this curving river highway, but Trevor was adamant that there were several more of these above-ground giant graveyards, each marking an entrance into this byway. Trevor had done his research to show that no hunting groups, fishing boats, or shipping containers utilized this river, overlooked on most maps and unnamed unintentionally, simply because of the mythos that weighed heavy on its apparent history, passed down from generations of the Eskimos, from word of mouth. He told me about the green doors that were once protected by these giants. They were like shortcuts or portals that could be used to bypass long stretches of brutal land, too unsafe for traveling. He would find the door at the mouth of this fantastical river and find safe passage to our land from there. He wanted me to come too, of course, but these campfire stories weren't enough conviction for me to endanger my life in such a way. He seemed to understand in some way, perhaps because he knew that he couldn't properly organize his thought process for me to follow. I remember that he also mentioned something about the enigma of the number 19. The coordinates to our land were marked by this mysterious number, or combinations of the string of numbers added up to 19, always 19. A lot of these green doors were thought to exist on the 19th parallel, and legends of these doors claim that the riddle of 19 would need to be solved before accessing one of these green doors. Something to do with the thought experiment of circling the square, thought to be impossible. Apparently these portals could also access the afterlife. So anyone who understood the enigma of 19 either went mad through their research or disappeared from the world. Well, Trevor has disappeared, but only because he did what he claimed he would. He loaded his truck with all the survival gear he could fit, including a wood-burning stove, and drove up the Alaska Highway to become an Alaska citizen, or better yet, a citizen of the natural world. He stopped sending text messages with pictures of the animals spotted along the side of the Alaska Highway, and he no longer answered emails. The last I heard from him, he was bumming it in a campsite, helping the camp host build cabins for the summer season. He remained in high spirits, excited to have found a lake that would provide him access to the above-mentioned river system. And then, when winter rolled around, I heard nothing from him, and I assumed that he was either hunkered down for the season or had found access to the unnamed river in the Green Door. I couldn't understand why that would be the case, as the river would surely be frozen, and I would assume he'd wait for spring, as he planned, when the conditions would be more manageable. Perhaps he'd rented a snowmobile and loaded a sled with supplies as I had recommended, as that would be the easiest way to travel the rivers, according to any expert I queried. Still, he didn't think this was the way to go, as the snow may be covering the Green Door. Then why wasn't he answering my multiple attempted calls and emails? Even if he was living at the campsite in one of those half-finished cabins, he'd at least have cell phone data to send a reassuring message of his safety, wouldn't he? I knew that he'd complained of the sparse cell phone service that far north, but he'd always found a way before, in his few short months in Alaska, to message me back. I began to fear the worst. But when spring rolled around and I still hadn't heard a word, I had the idea to check the GPS map he'd first showed me on the internet. As he told me, it was updated every few weeks, so I would be able to see our land just as the snow was beginning to melt. Maybe I'd see his heavy-duty tent pitched by the lake and see the beginnings of a cabin he had intended to start building right away. I typed in the coordinates into the GPS with all those 19s and watched the satellite images of our land. I was quickly caught by surprise by what looked to be a snowy roof of a structure parked at the shore of the half-frozen, unnamed lake on our land. I could be certain that it hadn't been there before winter. It had been undeveloped, raw land, and now it looked as though a good portion of the trees had been cleared, used to assemble the cabin. And this was no amateur cabin. It was hard to fathom the true scale of the structure, but using the lake and the few surrounding trees as scale, it was a mansion. It had to be 4,000 square feet at the least. Most unsettling were the large tracks in the snow that surrounded the outskirts of the cabin, and sometimes led off into the well-worn trails into the woods, only to be obscured by the cover of trees. And not far from the cabin's back door, standing on the edge of the lake, looking out across the water, was a giant figure, as tall as the house, and it was darker than pitch, featureless, but humanoid. The satellite image was only a snapshot in time, so I couldn't be sure if it was a strange shadow cast by a tree or the cabin itself. Maybe it was just a glitch when the image was uploaded to the satellite and rendered on the site. Maybe that would explain why the scale of the house looked so off. Yeah, that had to be it. Trevor was able to access the unknown river and find our land, Green Door or not, and he had successfully built a moderately sized cabin during the months, as he'd always dreamed of doing. And he was living his best life, off the grid and far from cell phone reception, which explained his radio silence. But I must have spent hours analyzing the dark figure, refreshing the page over and over again, and hoping for an updated image, but of course I found nothing. The more I obsessed, the less likely it seemed that I'd be able to wait a few more weeks for a satellite image to be uploaded. Maybe I'd see Trevor's blue canoe in the lake and his wood-burning stove spitting smoke. Or maybe that figure would be exactly where I left it. Or maybe near the front door this time, looking up at the camera in the sky and waving back at his unknown spy. Thoughts like this haunted my nights, and each time I looked at the digital clock on my nightstand, I always saw the number 19. I made the decision, just the other night, that the only way to prevent myself from unraveling into madness, like the rest of the poor souls who ventured down the rabbit hole of the 19 and the giant's green doors, would be to fly out to Alaska as soon as possible, before the lake was fully melted, and a snowplane could deposit me safely there. I had also done the research to prove that the lake was too shallow and small for a water plane to land and take off, but one outfitted to land on ice could get me there for $1,000 one way. I scheduled the flight with a local, seemingly competent pilot who was somewhat familiar with the area, but who seemed just green enough to believe that he'd have no trouble getting me there. I knew better than him that the window of time to get me there safely was slowly closing, but I didn't let on too much in fear of scaring away my greatest resource. I went to the outdoorsman's store and bought below-zero clothing and a sleeping bag, a hatchet, revolver, and a bucket of freeze-dried food to last me for 2 months. I at least knew there was a shelter waiting for me there, and I hoped that Trevor had enough meat and fish from his recent hunts to make up for the necessary nutrition I had overlooked. I had only planned to go for 1 month, and I scheduled my pickup date with the pilot. I also put in my PTO at my marketing job and hoped that my expedition wouldn't stretch the boundaries of that month-long PTO, as I would surely lose my job if so. I also bought an expensive satellite phone that I would gift to Trevor to use on the land so he could keep in contact with me, that is, if he was really there. That's why I had the revolver, I supposed, just in case I was entering the campsite that was not Trevor's and occupied by some squatter. I didn't think this was likely, seeing how difficult it was for someone to access the land. Anyone under normal conditions would have to travel by snowmobile on the frozen rivers or fly in, which was no easy or inexpensive ordeal. It had to be Trevor. It had to. Just in case, I logged the pilot's information into my satellite phone and informed him that I would call him if there was an emergency, and he agreed that he would act as my rescue for an extra 1,000, on top of the 2,000 I was already spending for my round-trip ticket. So on a clear April morning, I stepped off one flight, jet-lagged from my trip from the East Coast to the North, and drove my rental car packed with all my supplies to the private airport. There I met the pilot, a young man with a beard almost as long as Trevor's, but less gray and unkempt. We shook hands as he cupped a burning cigarette in his other palm, ready to prop back on his lower lip when he was done talking, and it was only a matter of minutes, beyond the extension of our pleasantries, that we both had run out of things to say to each other. The small confines of the plane and loud thrash of its engine were not conducive to chatter anyway. All he knew was that I was to meet a friend who had already prepared a homestead on the land, but he should hang on for a few minutes before taking off while I checked the cabin, just to make sure he was there and the place wasn't overrun with wildlife and squatters. The flight was sketchy to say the least, and my stomach beat inside my throat with my heart. My knees remained pushed up against my chest as I hugged my knees. I was told that the best chance of survival in a plane crash was to put your head in your lap and hug your knees. That was all I could think to do as I watched the many rivers and lakes zoom out into mere children's rain puddles in the patchwork of green and blue and white slated mountains below us. I'd never seen anything more beautiful and death-defying in my life, and I prayed to God for what seemed like the first time in a lifetime. My pilot seemed experienced enough to level his wings, but he chose to make drastic turns and drops in altitude that were questionable in the moment, but I could see how he was testing pockets of turbulence and dropping out if it seemed too hairy. Thankfully, the flight only lasted a short but notable 40 minutes, and we were soon circling Trevor's Lake, still white with snow and ice, although there were threads of blue showing on the shore. The cabin was much more noticeable now, and I could see that the pilot had spotted it right away, lining up his nose with it. It was huge, there was no doubt, and the pilot even exchanged a look with me, one complete with raised eyebrows. It was the size of a hunting lodge you'd see on any of the large, more accessible lakes down south. It was still rustic, which was easy to tell, and constructed from fallen trees in the surrounding area, but not pieced out into strips of lumber as Trevor surely would have done with his chainsaw, but constructed out of whole logs. Like giant Lincoln logs, pine trees had been stacked up 3 stories tall to make up the exterior of this mansion, and the dark figure was there on the shore. I saw it before the pilot, which was as tall as the first 2 floors of the cabin. Now, with the afternoon sunlight as reference, I could see that it was an unmoving effigy of some kind, constructed from woven branches and draped in dead greenery. Here stood a scarecrow, at least 30 feet tall, and it glared out at us with a single red-colored cyclops eye set like a sparkling jewel inside a carved wooden pyramid as big as the plane. The pilot landed safely and hurried to help me with my bags. As he went rummaging in the back, I hopped out into the brisk air and stepped onto the hard-packed sand of the lakeshore. I couldn't see any sign of Trevor's boat or footprints in the recent fallen snow. If the giant tracks had been there, as they were depicted on the GPS, they had long been covered, and nothing had been around recently, as far as I could tell. But there were no signs of life, which was most unsettling. I couldn't see any wood piles around a tree stump for a chopping block, as Trevor would have prioritized. I couldn't see any tools, no axe or chainsaws, which didn't seem like Trevor at all, and I would have been smelling smoke on the air from his fire. Trevor would have always had a fire burning if he was on site, so I could be certain that he'd left, perhaps on a hunting trip with his rifles. The pilot piled my long duffel bag and 0-degree sleeping bag at my feet and glanced up at the scarecrow for the first time with me. The red eye was indeed some kind of glass object, as it caught the light in an alien way that seemed to light up the grounds. Here was a green, foliage-adorned giant, with long arms and legs in the form of tree trunks, and that horrifying pyramid head serving as a lighthouse for distant travelers, or a warning. The pilot shook my hand, more hurried than before, and this time he forgot his cigarette in the snow as he rushed to climb into his cockpit. I yelled at him to stop and wait for me to check the house, but he was already in the front seat with the front propeller whirling. I watched with my hand shaded from the glaring sunlight as he slid across the soft ice and lifted off into the air. I wondered if he'd recognize the giant from legend. I wondered why Trevor would waste so much precious calories necessary for his survival to construct a monstrosity like that. Had he built it at all? I couldn't see how a man could do so, not without frames and pulleys to lift such large trees. Then I had to remember that the cabin constructed in front of me made even less sense. A one-man construction project. I counted 19 trees stacked up for each wall of the house. It towered before me like a wall, and I ventured past the scarecrow into the massive doubled back doors of timber, expertly cut and sanded down and fitted with heavy nails. The doors creaked open on their steel hinges, and I was surprised to see that the house was one empty shell with a vaulted ceiling of wooden rafters. There were not multiple floors, as the outside seemed to hint at. There were no windows on the back side of the house, where the scarecrow was situated, but there was one large glass window at the front of the house, which provided the interior with an abundance of light. It looked out at the mouth of the forest and its strangely linear trees, all growing in a line like a plantation. There was no furniture, only a giant-sized fireplace in the corner with a stack of unburned firewood. And even though it felt musty, the interior smelled of pine. I would have thought that Trevor would have outfitted his cabin with his wood-burning stove, as it was his pride and joy when he was living in the campground. I could almost be certain that he had never entered this cabin, and I could also be certain that no one had even spent the night in here. It was clean, with no soot in the fireplace or mud or snow tracked onto the hardwood floor, except from what I'd carried on the soles of my own boots. I closed the doors and saw that there was a heavy bolt that I could slide down in place in front of the doors like the interior of a castle. I set my things by the fireplace and marveled at how empty the place felt, as large as a football field and with nothing to fill it with. All I had was that giant window, which I saw was cut out in the shape of a rose window with curved edges. This was not the work of Trevor. He would not have even bothered with a window. And where had he gotten glass like this? I could also be certain somehow that the window was 19 feet tall. I stared out the window for what felt like hours, watching as the shadows from the trees traced along the clearing to touch the thresholds of my wilderness cabin, which I now suspected had been built just for me. To be continued. There's a giant out my window. I write this week into my trip here in the harsh wilderness of Alaska, and if you're reading this in what may be equivalent to a message in a bottle, then I have survived my ordeal where my body was discovered here in this mysterious cabin with no apparent architect. Thus, they have found my last will and testament, probably set out on my makeshift table that I have constructed to pass the time, made from discarded wood in the forest and a couple flat pieces of stone on the beach shore. I came out here, of course, to find my friend whom I had purchased these 7 acres with last year, when we were both hungry for the off-grid life and an escape from the creature comforts in the beast system. I took the coward's path, and I will have to live with that for my remaining days on this earth. He followed through with his dream and came out here to find the land alone. When he stopped texting me, I knew something had happened. Either he had fallen into trouble trying to discover our impossible piece of paradise, hidden away on any map of Alaska and otherwise unnamed and ignored due to its inaccessibility, or he had indeed made it here and could no longer reach out due to the lack of cell phone reception. I checked the satellite image rendered periodically on the state's websites and saw that a cabin had indeed been constructed on our land, but 10 times bigger than my friend Trevor could have ever managed on his own. I had to trust that Trevor was there, though. Maybe he had recruited a team of handyman to help him build the mansion in the remote Alaskan countryside. So I hired a pilot to fly me out there with all my survival gear and a satellite phone, only to find that Trevor was not here, and possibly had never made it here in the first place. However, I could not understand who or what could have possibly constructed the mammoth structure of 19 trees stacked up on all 4 walls, as long as a football field and naturally lit with a pristine rose window facing away from the lakeshore into the woods. And there was the alien scarecrow effigy built to guard the lakeshore, as tall as the structure and adorned with dead vegetation and standing tree trunks for the legs and arms. Most peculiar of all was the carved pyramid-shaped head on the thing's shoulders, adorned with a single red jewel for an eye. The thing had been large enough to be picked up in the satellite image, of course, but it wasn't until I landed here with my feet in the sand that I was able to measure myself before its terrible size and question its purpose with a sober mind. A week into my stay here, in this comfortable cabin, I cannot begin to fathom what its purpose might be. I roll out my 0-degree sleeping bag on the hardwood floor in front of the window, light a fire in the well-crafted fireplace, and clutch my revolver to my chest as I monitor the trees outside. I wait for the true owner or architect of the cabin to come walking out of those woods. I already have an escape route in mind. I discovered a hatch door in the back that accesses an earthen tunnel to the outside. From there I would be facing the lake and would at least have a running start. I also have my satellite phone, but I have held off on making any emergency calls. No, I will save that for an emergency, and for my final call to the pilot to come fetch me. It's good to know that the option is always available, though, especially when you're a stranger in such a strange land as this one. I will wait out my month here. It's the least I can do for Trevor, and for reneging on our previous plan to brave the elements of Alaska together and start our homestead. I made him come out here alone, and I pray that he will return to this cabin or finally arrive for the first time, with the coming thaw of the lake and the onset of spring. I took a month's worth of vacation time, so I'll spend it here. If he went off on a hunting trip or returned to town for whatever reason, a month should be enough time for him to return. I wondered if this was foolish thinking. Why would I still assume that he had anything to do with the construction of this fortress? He could have met the right contractors with the skills to pull off such a project, but to have it constructed in only 2 months' time over the winter when the elements would have been the most preventative, I couldn't convince myself that I was any safer without the pistol at my side. Part of the reason that I had resisted accompanying him on this trip was the strange conversations he tried to implicate me in, where his access to the land I was currently inhabiting hinged on discovering the mythed green doors of teleportation that had been guarded by an ancient race of giants, long extinct from this world. He also spoke cryptically of the riddle of the number 19 and how it fit into the impossible math problem of circling the square would activate the green door and give him safe passage to any place on the planet. The longer I stay on this land, with no sign of wildlife, not even a gray squirrel in the trees, eating my freeze-dried meals that I heat over my fire, the more I'm convinced that Trevor had lost his mind out here, wherever he ended up, and may have killed himself. I tried not to mourn him too intensely, as I knew in my heart that his main intention was to go out in that way, in the pursuit of what he believed in, freedom of the human spirit in the natural world. But I couldn't help but revel in my guilt, knowing that circumstances might have been different if I had been there to help him run the snowmobile or the boat on his expedition to the land I had accessed, with hardly any trouble at all. I felt like a cheater, like an unworthy transplant in a world I didn't deserve or couldn't begin to find sanctuary in. And on one of my first nights on the land, I saw lights dancing outside my window. At first they looked like flashlight beams, attached to the hands of a search and rescue team of a dozen odd men. The beams were trained on the forest floor, scouring the brush and fallen rotten logs, as if looking for a body. I wondered if they were searching for me out there, those flashlight people, which never raised their beams high enough to catch the features or the uniform insignias of one of their teammates. The beams forever scoured the earth, dancing in circles, slicing over the same crop of dirt, with no reason. I wanted to open the double doors and call out to them, begging for them to rescue me from my isolation, but I had to remind myself that I had put myself here on my own accord. Why should they wear out their manpower and state tax money on me, when I had the food, filtered water, and fire to last me long into the summer weeks? Maybe they were hunters searching for a deer they had shot, but why was there no rhyme or reason to their search? Why did they stay in the same area, circling each other for hours? They did not direct any attention to my cabin and its smoking chimney. They did not venture past the trees into my clearing. There was a time when they duplicated in number, multiplying into 24 lights, skating close to the ground, before they all snuffed out in unison. The next day I did not venture far from my grounds. I never did, just in case Trevor returned. I didn't want him to return and take off again on another mission. So I bathed in the lake and tried my hand at spearing fish that so easily skirted away from my shadow and regrouped in depths deeper than my steps. And when this sport grew tiring, I chopped wood, but on the forest side of the house. It was troubling enough to swim in the lake while that massive scarecrow loomed over the grounds. But each day there was less and less ice on the lake's surface, until there was a simple snowcap in the center. The water was surprisingly warm in spots, and I sought out these pockets just like the fish. And each day my wood pile grew, and when I got sick of the meals I boiled in my pan, I ventured a little farther into the trees looking for a squirrel or a rabbit. It's funny how much hunger changes a man, who only a few weeks ago would have cringed at the sight of another animal's guts. Now I wanted to sink my hands into another creature's entrails as I pulled them out of their cavity. I wanted to pick my teeth with an animal's bones. I craved that sensation of fresh, molten juices dripping down my chin, but I never caught sight of another creature, and I wondered if it had something to do with the scarecrow at the lakeshore, or the odd flashlight beams that whirred sporadically outside my window. They didn't reveal themselves to me every night, but on the nights they did, they changed their course slightly, one time raising above the ground and casting their light on the tree trunks. The lights seemed to conjure more shadows in the forest, until everything was dark again. Sometimes I felt like they were becoming just bright enough for me to make out some recognizable characteristics of who might be holding the lights, but they always escaped close discernment on my part. After that most recent encounter in the night, where the lights had reached up from the ground to touch the trees, I went out into the crop to see that something had been constructed there in the night. It had been the work of the same architect of the cabin and the scarecrow. I could be sure of that much. I couldn't see where the trees had come from, but a few had been cut down and raised high into the air, above my head, to come together in a strange lattice-work pattern, crossing through the trees. These spokes in a greater wheel were attached to the standing trees by heavy-duty rope that did not look to be store-bought but handmade. They looked like they belonged on a 7th century fishing vessel, as opposed to this slice of Alaska nowhere. I could not be certain what this was, only that it was part of some geometry that was difficult to see from the ground. When I traced one of the spokes back to the center of this apparent spiderweb of logs, I looked up at what I could only describe as the wheel of a dream catcher. It looked like a wooden net. Had the lights created this before my very eyes last night? It hadn't been there yesterday, and without any sounds of sawing or trees falling, here was this new construction for me to puzzle over. I did not leave the cabin for the rest of the day, but kept my nose pressed to the rose window, and the pistol was never far from my reaching hands. The lights did not return that night, and I pored over some of the materials on my phone that Trevor had sent me through email while he was working at the camp near Anchorage, building cabins for the host, only a few months ago. I had thought the material to be too schizophrenic at the time for me to take seriously, but now, after standing below that alien-made dream catcher in the trees, I was willing to dig into Trevor's reality. He had warned me that others had refused to follow this thread of research into the enigma of 19 and the concept of circling the square, as many had gone mad in their pursuits. It had been deemed an impossible task to construct a circle and square with the same area, and with only a square and compass. But Trevor claimed in his emails that he had seen reliefs etched into rock slabs in select places in the Alaskan wilderness, marking what he claimed to be dormant green doors. He figured that the ancients, and most probably the giants, had learned how to circle the square without a compass, with only their eye and a steady hand. He showed images of these rock slabs, where circles and squares had been nestled inside a hexagram. This was the key, Trevor highlighted in his notes. Trying to find a circle and a square with the same area introduced too much error because pi was a transcendent number that went on into infinity. It was when the area of one side of a hexagram was substituted for the side of a square that it was possible to circle the square. Trevor underlined that it was all laid out in the name. The hex and the hexagram acted like a magic spell that harnessed a fourth-dimensional magic that caused a reaction with the next realm, parallel to ours. That is when a doorway could be formed between worlds. He showed me equations where pi was being multiplied by 6, the 6 sides of a hexagram, which came close to the elusive 19, totaling 18.89. Was this the secret of the 19? He showed me diagrams where 19 dots could be constructed on one of these stone slabs, with a single dot in the middle, to construct one of the hexagrams. It would seem this shape was the secret to it all, as most platonic solids could be nestled inside it. This led to Trevor's final research on the flower of life, which was constructed out of 19 overlapping circles, creating a shape similar to what I was seeing in his pictures of these green doors. All the platonic solids could fit inside this shape. I wondered if I could find my own stone doorway in these woods to carve my own sacred geometry. Before I could dismiss this mad thought, a loud knock came on the double doors, and I almost threw aside my phone in surprise, watching the doors as they continued to shudder in their frame. I cowered there on the floor, watching through the window to see if the lights would return to at least shine some of their radiance my way and act as a porch light, but I could not see who might be out there, and the knocks never came again. However, I saw something big move outside my window, tall enough to block out the sliver of moon in the sky behind it. I could see the faint glint of red out there in all that darkness, capturing just a drop of the moonlight to reflect through the window. I could make out the head and shoulders of something very big, squaring up with the window and filling its frame completely. Massive hands rose up to cup the glass as the head leaned in to glance in at me. I thought it was wearing a triangular hat, but I could be confident that this thing either had the same sized head as the scarecrow on the other side of the cabin, or it had taken off the effigy's head to wear like its own helmet. Its red eye gleamed, and since I was under its roving spotlight, I could be sure that it could see me squirming in there. So I rushed to the fireplace to snuff out the rest of the embers with the bucket of water I had on hand, and with it went the rest of the light, and when I looked back, the thing was no longer there in the window. I didn't know if it was as intimidated by me as I was of it, but I couldn't see why it should be frightened of me. It was 18 feet tall at the least, or maybe even 19 or 20. I just hoped that I wasn't the squatter in this situation, trespassing in its home, where I was sure to be rudely awakened a second time, and this time with the means to get my full attention. It already had it, of course, and I didn't sleep the rest of the night, and the pistol never left my hand. To be continued. I haven't left this Alaskan cabin for several days now. I don't even know how long it's been. Is my month up or not? I'd only planned to visit my friend's land here for 4 weeks, just enough time to cash in on my PTO at work. Ideally, I would know when my month is up, after my food stores have been exhausted, but there may have been a day or two in there where I didn't eat. I ran out of firewood, so I rely on this 0-degree sleeping bag to keep me warm at night. Could easily go outside to chop wood, as I had been doing my first week on this remote 7 acres, as it was my only source of exercise. But I cannot venture outside these double doors any longer. They rock in their hinges every night when the creature returns to knock on them. It hasn't missed a night since that first midnight visit. I don't see its pyramid-shaped head in the rose window anymore. Maybe because it knows I'm watching the glass religiously, even though I'm terrified to see what might be looking back at me. It has a single glowing red eye, and I know it sees everything in the large room that is my cabin, like a laser scanner of my surroundings. It only knocks once or twice before leaving me, perhaps hoping that I will eventually forget what I saw that first night through the window and let it in. I don't know why it bothers to knock, as it is 19 feet tall at the least and could surely knock down those doors like dominoes if it wanted to. Just in case it is still out there in the daylight, awaiting for me to venture outside, I don't dare go out there. I think it knocks because it knows why I'm here, to reunite with my friend I purchased this land with. Our intention was to get a taste of the off-grid life, but I chickened out and he came out here alone to work on various campgrounds, with odd jobs until he was fully prepared to travel out here to our land. I came out here looking for Trevor, as I saw in the satellite images that a cabin had been built here on the land, and in only a few months' time. He never got back to me, and fearing the worst, I flew out here with my modest camping gear for a high price, which is what Trevor should have done in the first place. Part of the reason I didn't come out here with him is because he had talked too extensively about the mythed green doors, which would serve as shortcuts to other parts of the world, or worlds. They were said to be protected by the giants, and I am beginning to think that is true, judging by my midnight visitor. Had Trevor found one of the green doors, and was it protected by this creature, who won't let me sleep at night? I had reviewed the notes he sent me through email, which contained images of these supposed green doors, which were marked with sacred geometry, hexagrams, circles, and squares. Apparently there was a magic to the construction of these geometries on the rock slabs in the forest, involving the equal spacing of 19 circles in a hexagram pattern, and connecting the dots to create a circle and a square with equal areas within a hexagram, supposedly circling the square, said to be impossible by mathematicians and philosophers alike. Why hadn't he just rode a snowmobile out there, as I had originally suggested? Then I would have gone with him, and he wouldn't have gone out here alone to be a target for the tall creatures in these woods that everyone is too smart to even venture into. And I wouldn't be the newest target for it to hone in on with its red eye. No, he never had it in his mind to go the safe route. He wanted to find the green doors, whether they were still protected by the giants or not. I wondered if the doors in his pictures were located somewhere near the mansion-sized cabin by our own private lake. I should have known that Trevor couldn't have built this mansion with the materials he would have packed in. No, it was likely built by the 19-foot-tall thing that knocks but never enters. But why build this cabin, felling all these trees to stack up as protective walls from the wilderness? And why construct the scarecrow at the shore of the lake? And why fashion the scarecrow to be the same size and appearance, with the pyramid-shaped head and cyclops eye? Is this giant trying to attract more of his kind to our lands? Maybe it is knocking on my cabin as a warning that I should get out before more of his kin arrive. With that thought, I fired up my satellite phone, but I was horrified to realize that I would have to leave my sanctuary just to find an open spot in a clearing with no tree cover, so that I could point my phone at a clear section of blue sky. I had a pickup scheduled with the pilot at the lake as soon as the month was up, but would that poor fellow follow through with the plan? I paid up front, so he should arrive, but he was pretty quick to fly off when he first dropped me off, after seeing the 20-foot-tall scarecrow in front of the cabin, as if he had recognized the beast. I counted my freeze-dried packages of food and saw that I had enough for a few days at the most, but I at least wanted to follow up with the guy to make sure he was coming. I could run out to the lake, set the satellite phone down on the ground, and wait for it to connect, while safe inside the cabin. And then I could duck outside to grab the phone and send my SOS message to the pilot. Now at 10 in the morning, I scoped out the backyard and its crop of trees through my single window, but there was nothing alive to see out there, not even a bird in the sky. I could still see the latticework spiderweb, constructed of segmented logs connecting several of the standing trees. So much like a gate those trees resembled, separating my cabin from the deeper heart of the forest. Equipped with my .40 revolver, I unlatched the door with its sliding wooden bar and raced outside, leaving the door open a crack so that I could circle around to the beach and set up the satellite phone on the chopping block. I fired it up and then didn't waste a moment in securing myself in the cabin again. Unfortunately, the window did not face the lake, so I could not see the satellite phone from my vantage point. So I looked out at the spiderweb net through the trees out my window. I was glad that I hadn't seen the orb lights in the trees since one of my first nights in the woods. Then I heard a crackle and spun around to see that my fireplace had been restocked with firewood, and it had just been set alive and catching. I could already feel the heat from my other side of the room and smell the sweet pine fragrance of burning wood. In the 3 minutes I was outside setting up the satellite phone, someone had slipped in through the open door with an armful of wood, deployed them into the fireplace, and gotten the fire started without any evidence of lighter fluid or tissue paper. Had the giant done this? How in the world? The doors weren't big enough for a figure like his to easily pass through, let alone with the materials to start a fire. And for what reason? I didn't waste a moment in barging back outside to check on my satellite phone, and I wasn't even surprised to see that the chopping block was now empty. I looked up at the towering pyramid-headed scarecrow and knew that I was being watched at that moment. I pulled out my weapon and did a quick turn there on the lakeshore, going against my better judgment to threaten the creature to show itself, but nothing responded to my challenges. I heard something large and loud crack in the forest on the other side of the lake, and I retreated into the cabin's heat, but I knew I wasn't alone. On the other side of the cabin, a dark shape was hunched over by the fire, and I was surprised to find how relieved I was to see anyone, as long as they were my size. And then I recognized the head and shoulders and the long hair as it parted with a slight turn of its head my way. This was Trevor, finally returned to his cabin. I bridged the distance between us, but halted in my steps when I noticed that the fireplace's light could be seen through his back and chest. He looked at me through the sides of his eyes, which glinted in the orange firelight, and he grinned through his beard at me. Only his features were sharp in the light, but the rest of his form was smoky and unrealized. When he spoke to me, his voice echoed queerly in the vaulted ceiling above my head, and I wondered if this was the first time someone had spoken within those walls, and without vocal cords either. His voice came riddled with static, meeting me from the end of a very long subway tunnel. "I'm glad you got the email messages. That way you know what to expect when you go out there," Trevor told me. "Unlock the green door from your side, and I'll be there on the other, ready to come through." "What green doors? I don't know where to find them," I argued. "I'm not here with you in person, just in spirit," he said, tilting his head to gaze back into the fire. "I'm on the other side. I went through the green door, but I didn't know they had a ticking clock on them. I went back, but the magic was spent, and I was deserted here on the other side. You need me to open it on my side? I need you to catch your Cyclops friend in that trap I set for him in the woods. That's the most important thing." "Trap? That was you who built that?" He nodded. "It's much easier to build large structures over here on the other side. Those lights you saw, they were me, from the next dimension, a fourth-dimensional space. That's what construction looks like from your perspective down here in the 3D, like flashlights shining. I can pick up whole logs like toothpicks and put them together like toys. No, the giant didn't build this cabin. I did. I also built the scarecrow, but not to scare the thing away, but to attract it. You see, when I opened my green door, I did not heed the warnings from the locals to close it as soon as I did. So, while I went through, I allowed the Cyclops to come through into our world. If I had listened, I wouldn't have opened it in the first place, because I cannot reopen the door from my end. The magic only works on your side. I need you on that end to receive me. We need to send that thing back through if we can." "Because of the scarecrow, the giant is hanging around here, thinking one of his kind is close by?" I asked. "Yes," the Trevor Spectre said. "I made the cabin so that it was as big as a giant, so the Cyclops would believe one of his kind built it. It knocks on your doors every night, thinking it will be reunited with his kin. I've seen hieroglyphics on my side depicting the war of the giants, where most of his ancestors were killed. They seem to be the antagonists, the cannibals, I'm afraid, and they're eaters of humans." "Great. You brought a cannibal to my doorstep," I cut in. "I brought a giant cannibal to the doorstep of your world," Trevor replied. "How am I going to lure it into your trap?" I asked. "It must have seen it by now, and it must know I'm here. It looked me right in the eye through the window." "It doesn't see well in the dark. Lure it into the forest after the sun sets." "Why hasn't it attacked me if it's a people eater? It should have no trouble breaking in here and getting me." "It thinks you might know the whereabouts of the other Cyclops. It knows that you didn't build this cabin, and it doesn't know about me as far as I can tell. No one has opened a green door for millennia, I'm sure, so it believes in its hubris that another Cyclops brother or sister opened it from your end, needing rescue. This one knocking on your cabin door was ready to come through, as if he was hoping to find a lost relative on this side. Maybe there is another one out here in these woods. It must not be too threatened of me, or maybe it is. It stole my satellite phone as soon as I put it out there. No, I took your phone. I'm using it now to communicate with you. I can see you from my fourth dimension and manipulate objects like the firewood in the phone. Whatever I do up here eventually translates down to your world, like starting the fire in the hearth here. He said this as he held up one of his hands, indicating that the phone was right there against his ear, as if he was using the speakerphone to transmit his voice to me. It's a nice anchor object that I can speak through. The electromagnetic spectrum that this phone utilizes can also be accessed in my realm. Where's the giant now? You should be able to see it from where you are, I said. It's in the lake, and it is watching you. But like I said, it can't see great in the dark. It doesn't know what that wooden construction is in the woods. But once it bumps into it, it should snap like a bear trap. I fashioned it with springs and hinges. Time passes much slower up here, and I've had the time to put everything into practice that I've learned about in the 3D, like metalwork and glass blowing. I'd like to return to your dimension if I could, but let's set this right and get this thing back where it belongs. But how am I supposed to do that? I don't know where to find any of the green doors. You know how to open one. I moved one of the boulders close to the lake. You must have seen it. And I shaved down one side so that it's a flat enough surface for a door. I can't finish the door on this side. I will get to work now on carving the circles into the stone, but you have to connect the dots on your 3D level. It all needs to be done within the same stretch of time where the magic will start to die. You'll need to connect the dots and create the hexagram within minutes of me carving the geometry from my side for the connection to be made. Then you can come through to our land? That's the hope, Trevor said with a nod. But for now, let's make sure we kill that thing. And with that, I watched him fade out of view, allowing the phone to drop to the hardwood floor that he purposed. I sat there for some time, with the satellite phone and revolver in my hands, waiting for the sun to set out my window. I wondered if Trevor was still there with me, except in his own dimension, keeping an eye on the giant in the lake, or perhaps sitting there with me by the fire to keep me company. I wondered when I would know when to act. As soon as the sun set, was I to go out there to the lake, start carving into the boulder to get the Cyclops' attention? I broke out my large hunting knife, which I thought would do the job, but would that be enough to coax the monster out of the lake? What if it wanted me to reopen the green door so it could get through? Trevor made it sound like it wanted to be here in the third dimension, perhaps to continue searching for its loved one. But there were too many loose ends and unanswered questions to make me feel confident about this plan at all. I would have switched on the satellite phone a second time to get Trevor's plan B, but it looked like he drained all the battery with the last call between worlds, and I would have to wait. But when the time came and I saw the light dwindling and finally extinguished through the trees, I went back out there into the dusk, squinting to see over the lake. It was noticeably colder by the water, but there was not even a ripple on the mirror surface. I found the boulder that Trevor had indicated, not even 12 yards from the scarecrow, and I saw that a circle about the size of a quarter had already been etched into the rock's slate-like surface. I watched in amazement as a new circle began to materialize 1/4 of an inch to the left of the former one. I could be sure that Trevor was there with me, but in spirit, as he'd indicated. I could picture him in my mind's eye, stooped over the rock with a look of concentration, carving into the rock with his knife or whatever chisel he'd crafted up there in the fourth dimension. It looked like he was making quick work of evenly spacing those 19 perfect circles. So I unsheathed my knife so I could be ready, but I quickly realized I should be holding my gun instead. Looking out over the lake, I could see what appeared to be a dark iceberg on the surface of the water, a perfect triangle point that continued to grow in height and dimension as the Cyclops' head lifted. I saw its red eye, unblinking and reflecting the last of the sunlight in the western sky. It saw me, and now that I'd seen it, it continued to step out of the water. I watched the pyramid take full form, followed by its light pull of a neck, its razor-sharp shoulders, and swinging gorilla arms as it strode forward, turning the sequent mirror of the lake into a wake pool. It was black as pitch, and I couldn't make out any distinguishing features on its chest, arms, or legs, as if it was made of shadow or smoke. It rushed toward me, and all I could think to do was run with the gun and knife in each hand. I felt the earth rumbling under my boot heels as I circled around to stand on the other side of the wooden spiderweb trap. I yelled at it from my safe haven in the trees, brandishing my gun and even lining up a shot through the branches to squeeze off in its direction. I don't think I hit it, as large as a target as it was. I watched it lumber into view, bumping its shoulder into the brick chimney on the outside of the cabin and fixing its spotlight eyes on me, and it came after me, silent and smooth in movement, stepping 10 yards with each step and reaching toward me with a 6-fingered hand, as big as the plane I flew in on. Then it stepped into the line of trees, and its pelvis triggered the trap and caused it to close around its middle and chest, pinning its arms to its chest. When the trap closed, it ripped out a few of the standing trees on the ground around me, and I dove back into the clearing as the force began to fall in a domino effect of trees, striking their neighbors. A few more trunks fell and crashed into the thing's head. It did not scream, but it fell on its knees. It was buried in the tumbling logs. It fell still, with just the tip of its pointed head sticking out of the rubble. Relieved, I rushed back to the stone slab, just in time to watch the last circle as it was completed. I took that as my opportunity to start tracing the lines, from one circle to the next. And once I had the hexagram border traced, I went about drawing the square in the middle of that, and the circle inside the square, copying from my memory the green doors from the pictures Trevor had shared with me through email. Then the earth trembled a second time, but not from anything activated by the green door. That remained cold and dormant. I didn't know what to expect as soon as it was open, but I heard the logs rolling behind the cabin as the giant struggled to free itself, and I looked in time to see its head peeking out over the cabin's roof, one eye fixed on me. And now it was climbing over the cabin, hooking its elbows into the roof so that it could boost itself up and lift its weight up over onto the shelf. And then its long spider legs were bending and digging for purchase as its arms reached across to grip the edge of the roof and pull. The cabin groaned as it attempted to collect itself on the ground again. I didn't know what else to do but to turn and fire, but I quickly gave up on that when it continued to amble toward me. I slapped the boulder and screamed for it to open, begging for Trevor to work his magic on his side, but nothing happened. No visible doors had opened in the air. There were no dimensional rifts or floating portals of light, and I was running, tripping over my own feet and lying sprawled out in the sand as the thing closed the distance in one step. But it stepped over me and measured itself up next to the scarecrow, peering out over the lake. It seemed to crook its head to glance down at the green door at its feet, which did seem to be reflecting some unseen light like a glass surface. In fact, the lake had a strange new texture as well, as if it was the source of its own light, glowing a coppery orange. The trees all had white auras of light that flickered like candle flames, and the grass and rocks all seemed to glimmer with a dewy water. The sky was the most peculiar of all. Although it was twilight, and I should be looking up at a bluish-blackish screen with the beginning of twinkling stars, I looked up at a green sequent dome that radiated its own light like the lake. "Ah, I suppose the door is one way," a dejected voice said next to me. I straightened up in the sand to see Trevor standing next to me, hands on his hips, and as solid as the day I last saw him, before packing up all his things to venture across country on the Alaska highway. Now we know. I was afraid that might be the case, but at least we were able to confirm that for ourselves. We won't be going home anytime soon, at least not through that door. I returned my attention to the lake to see that more triangular heads were poking out of the water, as 2, 3, and then 4 giants came striding out of the lake, all with those red cyclop eyes. Sorry that I brought you into this world with me, but it looks like I did so just in time. That's not where we would want to be right now. At least here you won't have to worry about hunger or thirst or cutting firewood, Trevor said. So there were more of them in our world anyway, hiding and waiting. Yes, I thought they snuck through the door when I came through, but it looks like they've been in the 3D for a very long time. Maybe they just wanted us to open the green door one last time, so we trap ourselves in here and stop bothering them in their home. It looks like this was their lake first, and I guess they didn't like us squatting here. I was the squatter after all, I said under my breath. We both watched as the Cyclop giants walked off into the shimmering trees, until only the tops of their bobbing cone heads were visible above the canopy, and then gone. Huh. I'm realizing now that my journals can never be read by any of my family, my friends. I will have just disappeared into the Alaskan wilderness like Trevor, like so many others. And I'll be written off as another hapless hiker way over his head. If you're reading this, then I can't be sure you're in the 3D world I came from. Maybe you're here in this twilight zone with me and Trevor. Maybe we'll meet someday on either ends of an Alaskan lake. Maybe I'll be as solid as you, or a ghost of a shadow of my former self. If you see me, waving a hand, don't be concerned for me. The giants have left this world to Trevor and I. Perhaps we'll build something beautiful for the ones we've left behind, or maybe we'll just build a wall to keep the monsters out. Tune in next time for the next volume of Red Cave Podcast. Until then, guard your soul.